Hello, and welcome back to Gunfighter Life, the podcast where we come at gunfighting the right way, with God at the center, from a Judeo-Christian perspective. If you have been listening to some of the short episodes of Cartridge Talks, I hope that you guys enjoyed those. This is going to be a more traditional, full-length episode on more than just a single cartridge. On that note, while you're listening, don't forget to like, subscribe, leave a comment, leave a review of the podcast. Scroll down to the bottom, look at the place to leave a review. And if you want to let me know things that you want to hear about, you're the audience. I do this mostly to pass on the information God's blessed me with and the experience that I've been blessed with to you. So if there's something you want to hear about, by all means, either go down and write it in a review of the podcast, and I'll read it that way, or you can go to goodshepherdtraining.com. That's your one-stop shop. It's got a lot of other stuff on there, but you can go to goodshepherdtraining.com and contact me that way. With that, men and gunfighters, I'll roll into a bio. I think instead of the pre-recorded one, I'll just go shoot from the hip here. It'll be abbreviated. I may miss one or two things, obviously. Not all inclusive of who I am, of course. If you want to skip, you can generally skip to around 4 minutes in. So who's the guy talking to you? First and foremost, I'm a Christian. I don't apologize for that. God is number one, and I hope to honor him in all that I do. And this podcast is no different. I grew up hunting and shooting in the backwoods of the southeastern United States. I joined the Marine Corps at 17. I did a couple of combat tours in Iraq. After my combat tours, I was an urban warfare instructor and desert warfare instructor for the United States Marine Corps under Mojave Viper. I also served in law enforcement for quite a few years, LAPD, both regular assignment and more specialized assignment. So, by God's grace, he brought me through some nasty war zones and some nasty streets as a gunfighter. Not because I'm better than the men that didn't make it, but because God chose me and chose to have mercy on me and a purpose for me. I also served in the United States Army, both full-time and part-time National Guard. I have been a private contractor for a 3-letter government agency I won't specify. I started competition shooting even before I joined the Marine Corps at 17. I have been blessed to win more shooting competitions than I can remember. Been blessed with a lot of talents, and I try to use those. A state rifle and pistol champion, West Coast regional champion. Been blessed to win more competitions, like I said, than I can remember. I've also competed in shotgun and archery and muzzle loader and even hatchet throwing, things like that. Blessed be the Lord my rock, who trains my hands for war and fingers for battle. I've also been the commander of a tactical team, an SRT, Special Response Team, in a large metropolitan area where our main job was to stop active shooters. I've hunted all over this beautiful country, from white-tailed deer on the East Coast to mule deer on the West Coast to gray squirrel on the East Coast to prairie dog on the West Coast. I've been a professional hunter and guide, slaying all manner of beasts. Professionally hunting buffalo and elk and all manner of exotic creatures. I've slain wolf and bear with a gun or with a bow. It is God who arms me with strength and makes my way perfect. He makes my feet like the feet of a deer and sets me on high places. He teaches my hands to make war so that my arms can bend a bow of bronze. You'll find that in Psalm 18. So I've been blessed to do many things, but if you ask what I am, I'd say first and foremost, I'm a servant of God, a follower of Jesus Christ, a simple man called by God to share the good news of Jesus Christ, a teacher, a preacher, and a fisher of men. With that, guys, let's get into today's topic. This is going to be firearms nomenclature, broken down for the common man. Now, if you're a firearms nerd, a firearms nut, a ballistics nerd like I consider myself, then you may know a lot of this stuff already. Perhaps you want to share this episode with somebody who doesn't, somebody who's getting into guns, or somebody near and dear to you, because oftentimes it's harder to teach those. As Jesus says, no prophet has honor in his own country. I've taught I don't know how many countless civilians and military and law enforcement, but I find it much harder to teach my own wife because the paradigm is different. So if you have somebody you want to introduce to guns or get them into guns, you may want to extend this episode as a way to help them so they don't feel like they're going into a different world when they step into a gun shop and they start throwing out all these terms. Or if you're somewhere in the middle, I imagine you'll learn something today. So let's get into today's topic. Cartridge nomenclature, firearms nomenclature. Now, if I try to do all of these, it will be a very long podcast. If you guys like this, like I said, share, comment, let me know. Perhaps I'll do more of this. And a shout out before I start the first little bit of vernacular to my wonderful wife, whom I've been very blessed with. Smart and beautiful and wonderful. I was doing another episode and she was listening and she's like, I don't know what one of those terms is. So I thought surely a lot of other people could benefit from this. So to go quickly through the super basics. With a firearm, think of it like this. Go back to science class. You're turning a solid into a gas, which needs a lot more space. That builds up pressure. It has to go somewhere. A firearm directs that pressure into one direction. Take a piece of ammunition and put it on a table and detonate it, make it go off. It would just go out in every direction, or the directions with the least amount of resistance. By putting that in a chamber in a barrel of a firearm and closing it, you only let it go out in one direction, which forces that bullet out of a barrel. It's like when you boil water on a stove and that steam comes up, it takes up a lot of area, a lot of room compared to the little amount of liquid water that it boiled. Think of the same thing happening inside that cartridge very, very, very quickly in the fractions of a millisecond. And all that pressure has to go somewhere, and that forces a bullet out of the barrel. To initiate that, we'll get into the cartridge components. The very back of a cartridge, if you look at it, will have a priming component, usually a small little circle in the center of the very back of the cartridge. That's a primer. It's got a sensitive compound in there when struck, it starts a spark that lights the gunpowder, which again quickly turns into a gas and forces that bullet out of the barrel. The part that holds all the components together, the bullet that travels down the barrel and the primer and the powder, is called a cartridge, or a case, or a shell if we're talking about shotguns. And the projectile, usually referred to as a bullet. A quick aside, you may have heard Centerfire versus Rimfire. We talked about looking at the back of a cartridge and seeing that little circle. While some cartridges of old, the entire back of the cartridge was spread with that priming compound, and a few holdovers of today would be the 22 long rifles, 22 Magnum, things like that. That same compound is in there. It's just around the entire base of the cartridge, and that's called a rimfire because it strikes the rim, the firing pin, instead of the center. So there's a couple of common firearms vernacular right there. Now let's get into caliber, the standard and the metric version. Just like you have wrenches, standard and metric, if you're familiar with that. Caliber is the measurement of the bullet's diameter in inches. So a 50 caliber .50 is half an inch. So a 50 caliber machine gun has a bullet diameter of half an inch. A 25-06 .25 would be a quarter of an inch. So a 25-06 is a quarter of an inch in diameter. A lot of common American cartridges, the 30 calibers, 30-06, 308, .308, just a decimal point. So it's 0.30 inches for 30 caliber. Now, since the rest of the world went to the metric system, and we can argue about that or not, whether we like it, but the fact is that a lot of calibers in the U.S. got adopted by NATO, and therefore they have a metric designation. And that's just a different way of measuring. And to be fair, their way kind of makes a little more sense. Just from an understanding perspective. I'm not saying I like it better. But let's take the 308, .308 of an inch bullet diameter. If we convert that to millimeters, it will be 7.62 millimeters. And so the metric, the European way, 7.62 by 51, the X51, 7.62 by 51. The second number is the length of the case. So it's got a 7.62 millimeter bullet with 51 millimeters long case. Or a very common one, the AK round would be 7.62 by 39, a 39 millimeter case. The case, again, is the thing that holds the powder. So we could deduce that the 7.62 by 39 AK round is less powerful than the 7.62 by 51 NATO round because it's the same diameter bullet, but with a smaller case. Now, there's another way that things are measured, and that would be shotguns. Shotguns, in general, are measured in gauge. So as I understand it, the firearms of yore, the firearms of old, a lot of times were made by a custom gunsmith. And a lot of times that firearm, that musket, that black powder firearm would come with its own mold. It might have a very specific caliber and mold specific to that firearm. But when the Industrial Revolution happened, when people started making stuff in bigger numbers, they wanted to standardize on things. And standardizing on gauge for shotguns. So a gauge for a shotgun is how many lead balls of that diameter would equal 1 pound. You know, lead is an element and it should have a pretty consistent weight. It should give you a pretty consistent thing to make over and over again. So if you took a lead ball of the same diameter as the barrel and it took 10 of them to make 1 pound, that would be a 10 gauge shotgun. If it took 20 of those to make 1 pound, that would be a 20 gauge shotgun. And that's how gauge came about. The number of lead balls of that diameter or of that size to make 1 pound. So obviously, if we know that, then a 10 gauge is bigger than a 20 gauge. A 12 gauge is bigger than a 20 gauge. The oddball is a 410, which was kind of adopted as a different thing and brought into the shotgun world. But still, you know that it is smaller than the other gauges. The next term we'll talk about is wildcat. Sounds pretty cool, right? A wildcat. Well, now that we know cartridges and measurements and things like that, a lot of people, a lot of home hobbyists play around and reload and do their own thing. I started casting lead bullets and reloading at a very young age, helping my father reload and casting lead. I knew a lot of home hobbyists in times past would take a standard cartridge, like a 30-06 is the father and grandfather of a lot of cartridges. They would say, this 30-06, I want to make it shoot a smaller bullet faster. And they would take that 30.30 caliber bullet and say, I want to make a smaller and faster bullet. So they would neck it down. If you look at a rifle cartridge, a lot of modern ones, they have the case and then it has a neck and then it goes down to the bullet. Well, they would make that neck even smaller and do what's called necking it down. Hence the 270 was born. So you could deduce from what you know now that it's a 27 caliber bullet. They take a 30-06 and they neck it down to 2.7, giving a faster, lighter bullet. Or they would neck it up to the 35 Whelen, necking it up to a .35 caliber bullet. You'd get a heavier bullet at a more moderate velocity. Wildcatting, necking up, necking down. There are other ways to wildcat things, but for now, just know that wildcat was something that somebody takes and is not standard yet, and they do it themselves. And a lot of those calibers, again, become standard. The 270, the 7mm Aud 8. There are many, many very cool wildcats. There are many standard calibers that people wildcatted at home, and the big makers were kind of like, huh, that's a good idea. Let's take that and run with it. Another real common term, MOA. You might hear if you go into a gun store, MOA, MOA, this gun's MOA, this gun's half MOA. MOA stands for minute of angle. Now, I know this is not exactly true, but to make it easier to understand for the lay person. So, notice if we get into the nerdiness and the decimal points, this is not exactly true, but minute of angle, 1 inch at 100 yards. If I say my rifle shoots 1 MOA, that means that rifle will shoot several shots in a 1 inch group at 100 yards. and this is not always true again for the ballistics nerds, but again, if it shoots 1 MOA, it would shoot 1 inch at 100 yards, and theoretically, it should shoot 2 inches at 200 yards. So at 500 yards, it should shoot in a 5-inch group. It's a simple way to understand MOA, minute of angle. If it's 1 MOA, it's 1 inch at 100 yards. If I say my gun shoots a half MOA, that means it'll shoot into a ½ inch at 100 yards. If I say, like a lot of World War II guns, World War II sniper rifles, it's a 4 MOA gun. It's expected to shoot all its shots of that group in a 4-inch group at 100 yards. So now hopefully you understand MOA. And if somebody's, at the gun store bragging, my gun's a half MOA gun, then you know what that means now. It's kind of a common, well-understood way of understanding the accuracy of a given firearm or a given load or a given type of ammunition. You could also say that about ammo. You could say, this ammunition shoots 1 MOA out of my deer rifle. Another one you may hear thrown around all the time, ballistic coefficient. Ballistic coefficient. All these long-range shooters chirping on about ballistic coefficient or BC. A lot of times, even now, they don't even say that. They just abbreviate it to BC. Ballistic coefficient is just an object's ability to fly through the air, to penetrate the air. The higher BC in general, the better it flies through the air. If we gave an example and applied this to something like ships, you think about a small, quintessential rowboat, kind of short and stubby. It has a pointy bow, but it's got, a square stern. And you're just going out to go into a pond and go fishing. You're going to go rowing. And you think of that versus a super long racing kayak that's super long and super sleek. That super long, sleek kayak has a higher, if it was a bullet, ballistic coefficient than that short, stubby rowboat. And if you're going a long distance, that can add up and make a difference. The next term we'll talk about, sectional density. So if ballistic coefficient is the bullet's ability to fly through the air, sectional density is its ability to penetrate through other media, flesh, bone, ballistics gel, or what have you. Those numbers are generally related, but not always. Generally, a bullet with a higher BC will have a higher ballistic coefficient, but again, not always. For instance, if you have a bullet with a really square or rounded front and a square back that's still long for caliber, it may have a pretty poor BC to fly through the air, but it's still going to penetrate flesh very well. Let's say in your old, 30-30 rounds. All right, guys. All right, let's talk about zero and dope. So somebody will say my gun is 0'd 4. And not everybody does it correctly, but in general, if you say my gun, let's say my 243 Remington 700, one of my go-to, big game hunting rifles. If I say it's 0'd at 50 yards with Federal 100 grain, power shock, that means with that load, with that gun, where I put the crosshair on that scope, it should hit in that spot at 50 yards with that load. It's 0'd for that load. That's what 0 means. To understand that, you probably should understand point of aim and point of impact. Now, obviously, because of physics and because of gravity, I can't have a weapon that at a bunch of different distances shoots where the front sight, or where the aiming device, the red dot or the crosshair, where that is. I don't play video games, but I don't know if it's like this. On a video game, you just point a gun or something at a target and it hits it. But in real life, you have gravity, you have, different loads, things like that. So where that, let's say, crosshair or red dot, to make it simple, just a red dot, where that bullet crosses that path and your point of aim, that red dot, is exactly where that bullet's going to hit, your point of impact, that is your 0. You may hear something very common like, my AR is 0'd at 50 yards, and it's 1.5 inches high at 100, because that bullet is rising, not in relation to the bore, but it's rising in relation to the sight. And they may say it's 0'd again. It crosses that line again at 250 yards, the 50, 250, 0. So at those 2 points, it's 0'd. Your point of aim and point of impact are the same. Now, out past your second 0, Past that 250 yards, your bullet will be, let's say, 12 inches low at 300 yards, and maybe 36 inches low at 400 yards. And all that information colloquially is known as dope. That would be your rifle's dope. If you had a notebook and you wrote all that down, my rifle is zeroed with this load at this distance, and this high at this distance, and this low at this distance, with this sight at this setting. All that colloquially is known as your dope. Your rifle's dope. Oh, this podcast could get really long, so I'm going to do a couple of more and then we'll call it. Again, let me know if you like this kind of stuff or if not. Another term you may hear that you may not know is a squib round or a squib load. That's if somebody mistakenly, either a manufacturer or an individual, loads a round with just a primer without powder or without enough powder to get the bullet out of the barrel. Or perhaps the round got wet or is super old or something like that, and there's not enough potential energy in that cartridge, and when it detonates, that round gets stuck in the barrel. That's called a squib. And then next we'll talk about extractor versus ejector. I think a lot of people confuse this, even, moderately well-versed gunfighters. If you can picture in your mind, or if you want to pause the podcast and go look it up, picture your quintessential, most popular handgun today, the Glock 19 or Glock 17. If you can picture that, when you let that top of that firearm, that slide, push that round into the chamber, when you go to pull it back, there's a little claw that grabs that round. Notice on almost all modern rounds, there's a little reduction in the diameter at the back of the case that lets something grab onto it. That thing, that claw that grabs onto it, that thing is the extractor. It extracts that round out of the chamber. As it's flying backwards, if you've ever disassembled your Glock or your M&P, you'll notice not on the slide, but on the frame, there's a little piece of metal that sticks up, like a little finger or a little tooth that stands up. It's generally on the opposite side of the claw that grabs it, and when it's pulling it back, it hits that thing with some amount of force, and that kind of bounces that case to the side and shoots it out of the gun. It ejects it, and that's your ejector. That's your extractor that grabs it and your ejector that kicks it out. And this may help you, again, if you're a newer shooter or something like that. If you're having issues with your gun, think about that. And somebody's asking you what's wrong with it because they're trying to fix it or something like that. You can say it's having trouble grabbing it. It's not grabbing the case. It's probably a problem with the extractor, or it's not extracting properly. Or if it is pulling it back but it's not kicking it out, you may say my gun's having ejection issues, ejection problems. I often hear that as a stovepipe. That's a common vernacular term because it's a pretty common malfunction for handguns or rifles. Having a stovepipe, for whatever reason, you have that round stuck in the area where it's supposed to be gone from, where a new round is supposed to be going into the chamber. Another real common term will be a double feed. You have two rounds trying to feed into the chamber because of one of those issues we just talked about, or for maybe a different issue, a really dirty gun or crap ammo. But you have a double feed, two rounds trying to feed into the area where that one round is supposed to go. A double feed. All right, guys, we're like 22 minutes into this. Like I said, I don't know how much of the gun nerdiness the, listener of this wants to handle. So I think that we will start to wind down this episode. If you have any corrections for me, any feedback, again, you can leave a review of the podcast and put it in there, or you can go to goodshepherdtraining.com. You can contact me on there. If there's some term that you would like to know about, something like that. Your one-stop shop for basically all of that is goodshepherdtraining.com. If you learned something in this episode, if you think that something is worth $1, we all know what a box of ammo costs nowadays. And if you need a box of ammo, like you don't have a box and you need it, by all means, buy the box of ammo and forget about supporting me on Patreon. But if you have a couple of boxes of ammo and you're just buying more because you want it, if you think the knowledge and experience you've gained in this episode or any other is worth $1, the fraction of the cost of a fancy city cup of coffee, consider going to goodshepherdtraining.com, scrolling down to Patreon, and contributing. These podcasts are free for you to listen to, and that's a blessing, but they're not free to produce. So if you want to support the tribe you're now a part of, If you like this podcast, you may also like the Alpha Male podcast. Or if you care about the important stuff, you may also like Simple Man Sermons, the preachings of a simple man called by God to share the good news of Jesus Christ. Again, any of that, you want to check out pictures, you want to do any of that stuff, goodshepherdtraining.com. As a thank you for listening to the end of the podcast, I'll throw in a tactical tip. Tactical tip of the day actually doesn't come from me. It comes from one of our Patreon supporters. Shout out to Jackson. We have talked about in the past, survival guns, the single shot shotgun, as it's very utilitarian, very good way to get into firearms. And Jackson wrote to me about the Aguila mini shells. If you haven't seen these, they are shotgun shells, but they're quite a bit shorter and lighter than regular shotgun shells, which if you're talking about carrying them on foot can be a great advantage. One of the things people often tout as the 22 being better survival gun than the shotgun, which I don't know that I would agree with. But a lot of people say that because the ammo is lighter. Well, this isn't going to make your shells as light as a 22, obviously, but it will make your shotgun shells quite a bit lighter than your standard shotgun shell. And if you've ever picked up a box of these Aguila or Federal mini shells, they're quite a bit smaller and handier and lighter than your standard load. And Jackson pointed out that they make these in birdshot and buckshot and slugs, and they're still quite deadly. Their payload still be quite suitable for defense, the slug suitable for taking medium to large game, and the buckshot suitable for defense or taking game at short ranges. And obviously the birdshot will be just fine for taking smaller game. So a very handy way. May not work in your semi-auto or your pump shotgun, but in a single shot or a double gun or something like that, a great handy way to use the gun that you already have and increase its versatility and its ability to carry more ammunition. So again, a shout out to Jackson, and thanks again for supporting on Patreon to all the patrons. With that, guys, I'm going to say thanks and have a blessed day.